so nice to have you back with us, Neil. The last time we met was 2011, but at the India Today Conclave. Today we've connected back, and it feels as if I'm meeting an old friend. Except you don't look old, you look very young. We will get to your anti-aging secrets, but before that, what has changed since we met you last in 2011 in the world and in India? Give us some broad strokes.
Well, back in 2011, when we last met, I was talking about the fundamental problems of American power and of Western civilization, and I even made the old joke about Western civilization that Mahatma Gandhi made in the 1930s when he said it would be a very good idea. So my arguments then were, A, there's a problem with American power, and the problem is that the United States does not really want to run an empire, and yet it finds itself deploying troops all over the world with a mounting debt and a fundamental lack of political enthusiasm. This was the kind of backlash against Iraq and Afghanistan that was already obvious back in 2011. Fast forward to 2024, we've had two presidents since then. We've had Donald Trump, and now we have Joe Biden. We may be getting Donald Trump again. What's interesting is that no matter who the president is, whether it's Obama or Trump or Biden, they have the same problem. They would like not to be involved in faraway places with problems, whether it's Ukraine or Israel, or for that matter, Taiwan, but they just can't walk away. So that, I don't think, has changed. If anything, the problem's got worse because the debt has got bigger, and I think the public appetite for what they now call forever wars has got even less than it was in 2011.
Now, one of the things that was said about the modern day world is that we are moving away from the kind of wars that we saw during World War I, World War II, physical military aggression. And then Russia invaded Ukraine. Now we've got Israel versus Hamas. How do you see this play out in a historical arc, given that the general sense was that we won't see these kind of physical ground battles that we're seeing right now?
Well, I think that was a delusion of what I'm going to call the interwar period between Cold War I and Cold War II. I think we've been in Cold War II now for the last 5 years or so, but it's taken people a while. Many of the assumptions of the 1990s and 2000s, I think, were false, that we'd sort of left behind the days of large-scale conventional conflict. And I don't think that was ever really true. Admittedly, the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan were relatively small by the standards of the 20th century, but it wasn't as if the Russians had got rid of their tanks. And when they deployed them against Ukraine in February of 2022, many people were shocked. I was one of the few people who had consistently predicted that that was going to happen at the beginning of 2022. Israel probably has another war to fight against Hezbollah, potentially in the next couple of months. And hanging over the world, there is, of course, the threat of a US-China conflict over Taiwan, which would be a much, much bigger deal than any of these other wars. So the world has left behind the peace dividend. We're no longer in that interwar period when we thought that we'd left behind nuclear threats. Putin made those threats on more than one occasion since he invaded Ukraine. And I think we're all gradually adjusting our sights to that. And you see that here at Davos. This has been the high temple of globalization for decades. But the themes this year are fragmentation, and you find more and more of the conversations are about conflicts. I was at a dinner last night. The number one topic of conversation was Israel. Number two was Ukraine.
What about the fact that some of the myths about Russia and Israel have been broken through this war as well? About, you know, this amazing Israeli intelligence and Russian military power. That hasn't really played out.
Well, yes and no. I think it's true that the Russians performed dismally in the opening phase of the war. In fact, they lost the Battle of Kyiv spectacularly. But since then, I think the tide has turned in Russia's favor, and one can see this very clearly in the fact that they now outgun the Ukrainians in terms of artillery. They're waging an air war against Ukraine that is really proving very difficult to withstand with the air defenses Ukraine has. And so one has the uneasy feeling that the tide has turned in Putin's favor. And ultimately, although it opened badly, as in many previous wars, Russia is able to step up just because of the raw resources that it has in the second phase of the war. Israel's intelligence failed not because nobody knew Hamas was going to attack, but because the people in charge in Israel chose to ignore the warnings. And I think future historians will wonder why that was, why Bibi Netanyahu, who had for so long had a reputation for toughness, missed something that was, as far as people watching closely were concerned, fairly obvious. So that some of the people I know who are experts in the region had been warning throughout last year, prior to October the 7th, that something bad was coming. The mystery is that those at the top of the Israeli government missed it.
In Russia's long march, how does Putin's invasion of Ukraine impact how the world sees Russia and where Russia potentially goes from here? Could Putin now win, you think?
He could. I'm going after this interview to a session with Ukrainian representatives, and the topic of the discussion will be, what if Ukraine loses? You know, last year nobody was talking about that. People would debate, you know, how quickly can Ukraine win, and how big will its counteroffensive be? And people would sort of talk as if the worst case scenario was a stalemate. And I've been saying for a while, you have to remember there's an even worse scenario than that, and that's a scenario of Russian victory, and that's not inconceivable. Russia could launch an offensive this summer in 2024, gain even more territory. The more territory it gains, especially in the south, the harder it will be for Ukraine to be viable after that. So I think we're in a very, very dangerous phase of this war. People in the United States and in Europe have to get real, because they cannot afford to let Russia win this war. The costs would be enormous. That would create a whole new set of threats for Western Europe that we haven't had to live with since the end of the Cold War.
How could that impact Europe and the NATO project?
Well, I think right now, Europeans have been talking for years about strategic autonomy. The difference is they have to do something about it now. That means they have to spend more on defence. 2% of gross domestic product is supposed to be the target. Many NATO countries don't even spend that. Historically, it's a low number. They really need to spend more than 2% of GDP on defence, particularly if Russia is on their borders, which for Poland it would be if Ukraine were to be utterly defeated. So this is a really, really critical moment in European history. I think a lot of people talk about Ukraine after the initial invasion. And I'm struck by the fact that those people who were so ready to back Ukraine in 2022 have sort of lost interest now, to the point that American money has ceased to flow to Ukraine. Last year, people would say, oh, it would be terrible if Donald Trump were re-elected because funds for Ukraine would be cut off. Guess what? They've already been cut off, and we're 10 months away from the presidential election.